moving from our study of Plato to our study of Xenophon. And Xenophon is an interesting character. He's roughly a contemporary of Plato, and based on some things that he says in his writings, he seems to have known Socrates. Xenophon wrote a number of books, but of all the books that he wrote, my favorite is not actually the Memorabilia, even though that's what I'm teaching from this semester, but The Education of Cyrus. The Education of Cyrus is, in my view, Xenophon's masterpiece. I don't teach it in this semester because he doesn't talk about Socrates directly in this book, and I want to sort of have the theme of Socrates, as you know. So I have to use the Memorabilia. However, The Education of Cyrus is obliquely about Socrates, or at least reveals the way Xenophon thinks about Socrates to some degree, because Cyrus oftentimes appears as kind of a Socratic figure in the sense of like Xenophon Socrates. That said, Cyrus also appears highly manipulative and someone who benefits himself while seeming to benefit others. Because the story, The Education of Cyrus, is about a conqueror. And there's a sense in which the similarity between Cyrus the Great, as described in this book, and then Xenophon Socrates, as described in this book, makes us wonder if Socrates isn't also a kind of a conqueror. Not conquering land the way Cyrus the Great did, but conquering our minds. And one of the things that you see in Xenophon's portrayal of Socrates is that insofar as Socrates benefits people, he gets them to act like him, right? That the more you learn from Socrates' teaching, the more you act Socratically. And insofar as I think many of Socrates' behaviors in the Memorabilia are sort of good ones, that's fine. But it also raises the question of what exactly Xenophon thinks Socrates is doing. Is Socrates merely asking people a bunch of questions and maybe introducing these theories about forms and ideas the way Plato suggests? Or is Socrates doing something much more dramatic and much more subtle of taking over the minds of people, getting people to change their behaviors and change how they think to model and imitate him? And if so, A, is that creepy? Is that corruption? Is that something that we should be okay with? And then second, is he replacing one nomos with another? And is that new nomos that he's introducing based on reason and philosophy the way? So the difficult thing about Xenophon, and the thing that I think makes Xenophon interesting, is that he's probably writing sometime after Plato started writing his recollections of Socrates. Xenophon had a wild life, and he didn't begin writing his books till the end of his life. He was a soldier for Athens for a while. He was a mercenary working for the Persians. He was a farmer. He did a lot of things, and it's only towards the end of his life that he began to sort of take up the pen to start writing. So when we're reading Xenophon, part of what we're reading is a response to at least the early Platonic works, right? And those would be some of the ones that we read. And so when we're reading Xenophon, there's kind of a triangle that we have to jump back and forth between. One point of the triangle is Xenophon and his depiction of Socrates. Another point in the triangle is Plato's depiction of Socrates. And then the third point in the triangle is where these two meet, and that's where the action is. And we sort of have to ask ourselves, why is Xenophon writing these texts and disagreeing with or correcting or bouncing his ideas off of Plato's Socrates? Because it's in the comparison of what Plato says and presents and what Xenophon does that we get the interesting things about Xenophon. If you read Xenophon on his own and don't compare him with Plato, then it's like, oh, right, he's this guy, he's telling some stories about Socrates, he has some points and things. But you read Xenophon, ask yourself always, how is this different from Plato? Because if Xenophon agreed with Plato on everything, there'd be no reason for him to write. He's writing to kind of correct Plato in the broadest sense of the term correct. Maybe to reinforce what he said, maybe to criticize what he said, and maybe to negate what he said. And ultimately, the sort of the debate or the conversation between Xenophon and Plato is not about Socrates. It's about philosophy itself, how we should think about philosophy and philosophers. One of the things that we'll see in Xenophon is that he thinks philosophy is much more problematic than Plato does. In Xenophon, while he finds a great number of things in Socrates and therefore philosophy to be admirable, he doesn't think it's as clear-cut as Plato does. One of the concerns that Xenophon will have, and it's one that Plato has too, is about the relationship between philosophy and the city, right? So in Plato, there's this concern about, does Socrates corrupt the youth? And in Plato, we saw that from the perspective of the traditional Athenian, he corrupts the youth. But from this higher perspective, the perspective of philosophy, Socrates improves the youth. It only seems like corruption if you're down here and you have the prejudices and the naive beliefs of the Athenian. But if you're up here, then you realize that Socrates is actually improving the youth. That doesn't mean that Plato thinks that everything is like then solved and you get up here, because we do have the problem of what if everyone is a philosopher and how could that be? And that's something that Plato addresses in a long text called the Republic that we're not going to get into in this class. But generally speaking, Plato thinks that philosophy is a good thing, and that if people were philosophical, they would recognize that philosophy is a good thing. Xenophon, I think, has a more subtle view. Xenophon thinks that philosophy has two sides to it. It is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. And it appears as both from the philosophical perspective, that the philosopher himself or herself can raise questions about the value of philosophy. And so we'll see how Xenophon does this in his depiction of Socrates in the first couple chapters of the Memorabilia. It's arguable that while Xenophon finds Socrates admirable, he doesn't find him infallible. And part of what Xenophon does in his Memorabilia, or his recollections of Socrates, is present a view of Socrates that is in a sense more human and humane than Plato's Socrates, but also more flawed. And insofar as Socrates is taken as a representative of philosophy, or a philosophical way of life, there's a sense in which one can wonder if Xenophon thinks that the philosophical way of life itself is a bit flawed. Ultimately, Xenophon, I think one could say, has more respect for the institutions and traditions of Athens than Plato does. Right, in Plato, as we saw in parts of the Apology and in the Crito, Athenian democracy is essentially kind of a bad thing, right? The rules or the laws were made by those without knowledge, merely by those who win a lottery or are the most persuasive speakers, and to that degree, right, they do stupid things like putting Socrates to death And essentially the people of Athens, in Plato's view, are incapable of seeing what's good for them. Right? This is partly why Socrates appears as a threat to them. So in the papers, I tried to get you guys to sort of get in the head of the Athenians by writing these sort of accusations of Socrates so that we take them more seriously than they're taken by a lot of philosophers. But I mean, there is a sense in which, while Plato thinks that there is something to those accusations, he also, I think it's fair to say, thinks that ultimately where Athens and Socrates disagree, Socrates is right. If you were to look at Xenophon, I think Xenophon would say where Socrates and Athens disagrees, it's not obvious that Socrates is right. I think the best way to get what's going on in Xenophon and what's unique about him is to talk about this word in Greek, nomos, N-O-M-O-S. Nomos can be translated as custom or law or tradition, like something like that. Plato's Socrates, I think it's clear to say, is a critic of nomos, right? He wants things to be based on logos, on argument, on knowledge, on philosophy, and not merely on tradition or custom. And the law, insofar as there is a law, should be based on, philosophical understanding and not just on what's always been done. Xenophon, I think, has a slightly different view of the relation between nomos and philosophy. And I think Xenophon worries that, so I think that Xenophon has a higher opinion of nomos than Plato does. That for those who are not philosophers, and for those who don't have the time, patience, or inclination to be philosophical, then nomos is as good a guide to life as one is going to get. And so the problem then becomes that if nomos is subjected to sort of the rigorous philosophical critique that one sees at Plato, those people who are not Socrates's, and who would have guided themselves through life by appeal to custom and tradition, now are rudderless. Now they have no way to navigate their way through life and to know what's right or wrong or things like that. And so this comes up in the text from Xenophon when he's considering the charge of the corruption of Socrates corrupting the youth. Xenophon says, well, there are these guys, Alcibiades, that spent time with Socrates when they were young men, and they later went on to basically be terrible people. And people blame Socrates for this, and they shouldn't. And the reason why Xenophon says that they shouldn't is that they behaved well when they were with Socrates, and they only misbehaved after they ceased to be under Socrates' influence. Right? So it seems superficially that Xenophon is just saying, well, Socrates was a good influence on these people. They went bad after they had been away from Socrates for a while. But when we dig a little deeper and look at how they went bad, and I think Xenophon wants us to dig a little deeper, we see that they went bad in a sort of very Socratic way. So Xenophon relates a conversation between Alcibiades and Pericles about the law. And you see Alcibiades asking Pericles these questions about the law that are very sort of Socratic sounding, right? Asking for a definition of the law. And what about this, Pericles? How about that, Pericles? But what you can see Alcibiades is driving at is that law is merely a function of power. And whoever has the most power makes the law. And this might remind you of what some of the things that Crito says in Plato's Crito, right? So it seems like Alcibiades is driving towards a fairly Socratic point, although he takes it in a radically different direction, right? Because the direction that Alcibiades wants to take it in is that therefore I should become the most powerful person so I can do whatever I want, rather than as Socrates in Plato would have you, therefore we should base the law on philosophy and knowledge. Right, so we can see how the behavior of Socrates in his questioning and so forth, and his method of questioning, sort of sets up the kind of, for lack of a better term, sort of a social cultural nihilism of a guy like Alcibiades by, in a sense, setting him free from tradition. That setting him free from the traditional sort of piety towards the laws of Athens and towards the customs of Athens, and making Alcibiades think that, well, these laws and things are merely a function of power, therefore I should just get the most power and do what I want. Further cementing this reading of Xenophon is that he presents Socrates much earlier in the chapters we read for today, talking about why persuasion is better than violence. And the reason that Socrates gives for persuasion being better than violence is not in Xenophon an appeal to the fact that, right, persuasion might bring someone to knowledge or something like that, but rather that when you can persuade people to do what you want them to do versus beating them up and forcing them to do what you want them to do, it's easier, you need fewer people to help you do it, and things like that, so that ultimately Xenophon presents the Socratic method as a way of getting people to do things that you want them to do without having to hit them over the head. Right? He presents the Socratic method as a kind of instrument for manipulating or dominating people rather than as a instrument for coming to knowledge and so Xenophon, Socrates, as we begin to dig a little deeper into it, can almost seem to be a little creepy, right? That his Socratic method is not a way of coming to knowledge, but it's a way of persuading people to do what you want them to do or to act how you want them to act. So Xenophon, Socrates, can appear as a very different kind of figure than the one in Plato, right? Xenophon, Socrates seems, on the first time you read it, he seems fairly innocuous and almost simple compared to Plato's Socrates. But the second time you read it, as you read a little deeper, he seems a little more manipulative and a little less sort of idealistic. So is Socrates simply asking a bunch of questions and then inadvertently people begin to imitate him, which is what Plato suggests is going on in the Apology, right? Socrates says, I never set out to have this influence on people. I was just trying to ask questions for my own benefit, and then people started to find that entertaining and imitate me, right? So that Socrates' influence is sort of accidental in Plato, or, as Xenophon suggests, is Socrates actively going out to try to persuade people to think like him, live like him, act like him? And if you look closely at Xenophon's text, you'll see that Socrates says, I don't expect payment for this because I think that having friends that think like me, act like me, live like me will ultimately benefit me, which suggests that Socrates is ultimately out for his own purposes and his own benefit, that his attempt to persuade people to live what one could call a virtuous life is not for their sake or for the sake of virtue, but for Socrates' sake. In the same way as Cyrus will persuade people to do certain things and to take certain decisions or certain policies or act in certain ways that ultimately benefit Cyrus. They may inadvertently benefit, but the main goal is to benefit Cyrus. So the question that we have to ask is, who is Socrates trying to help?